You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NVOCCs.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how you doing?
I'm doing excellently, and as you can see, for once, I am back in my home office in extremely cold and snowy Denmark.
Home base. Yeah, I bet it's really snowing there right now. Probably super cold. Hope you're staying warm there.
Oh, yes.
Well, today we've got a very awesome episode, lots to talk about. Just to give you a brief overview, we're going to talk about market signals, post-Chinese New Year, how spot rates are sliding across major lanes. And the big headline is not just price, it's how the networks are being rewired. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about Hapag-Lloyd acquiring ZIM. We're going to talk about rate spreads between origins, and then the Ocean Alliance's Day 10 network strategy for 2026. So let's get into it. Lars, can you talk about where the rates are at this week?
Yeah, you can say no surprises there. Rates are continuing to decline, as also expected, because we are in the weak season. I will say we're after Chinese New Year. Of course, Chinese New Year happens, I believe it is tomorrow, the year of the fire horse, which sounds very dramatic. But rates always spike several weeks prior. And when we look at the loaded spot rates from the NIFI, if we look over the past couple of weeks, we have seen the average on the Transpacific into US West Coast down more than $300 in just 2 weeks. If you look at the sub-indices, the worst decline is actually seen from Southeast Asia, which is down more than $400 per 40-footer here just over the last couple of weeks. US East Coast is also down slightly less, in this case $250 down from the entire part of Asia, most down from China in this case by $300. Asia-Europe is also declining, down by $300 per 40-foot over the past 2 weeks. All of this is the usual post-Chinese New Year blues, and we should expect this to continue for several weeks more to come. But then I dug into this week's NIFI data and also looked at something else, namely the spread. We talked a little bit about it last week, where at times it's interesting not just to look at what's the actual rate, but what's also the spread, because different shippers, depending on whether you're large or small, obviously have slightly different rates. And here I found something interesting, because if I look just over the last 2 weeks, what I looked at is what we would call the 1090 spread. So it's at the lower end, the rate paid by the 10% of shippers that pay the lowest rate. And the 90, that's the all the way up where it's the 10% that pay the highest thereof. And if I look just 2 weeks ago, and if I look from China to US West Coast, the spread was $500 per 40-foot, which is actually a pretty sizable spread between those that pay the least and those that pay the most. But that was 2 weeks ago, a $500 spread. Now, that spread has narrowed dramatically to just $200. And I see the same pattern if I look from Southeast Asia over to US West Coast. It has dropped from $650 down to just $300 in the spread. Northeast Asia, down from a $700 spread to just a $350 spread. And why might that be? I mean, there can be many different elements that goes into why that spread suddenly changes. But usually we would tend to see a market where if the spread is extremely high, that could either signal there's a huge difference between the different shippers that are out there. But if that is the case, you would also expect that spread to remain more or less the same, because from 1 week to the next, we don't suddenly see a huge increase in small shippers or a huge increase in large shippers. Right. That customer mix stays the same. So if it was the customer mix, the spread should stay the same. A sudden change here in spread from a huge spread to a much smaller spread seems to indicate a larger degree of certainty in the market in terms of what are the actual market conditions. If there's a large degree of discrepancy, if a lot of shippers and carriers see very differently on what are the market conditions now and in the immediate future, that can lead to a very large spread, because you can end up in very, very many different price points depending on your interpretation of the market conditions. When that spread suddenly narrows, it would also seem to imply that shippers and carriers are now rapidly becoming much more aligned around what is the actual market condition. And the actual market condition clearly is one where rates are going down, as we were also alluding to. So in this case, at least there's more surety of where the market is going. Interestingly enough, this is not what we see on Asia-Europe. In Asia-Europe, the spread has not changed over the last 2 weeks. We have a $600 spread per 40 foot, and it has stayed that way for several weeks, more than the 2 weeks as well. So there's not much more change in, you can say, the uncertainty of market conditions in Europe, but we get more certainty in the Pacific, but that appears to be a certainty around an understanding that the market conditions are heading southwards.
You think it's a plausible theory that the spread is lessening because of maybe stability around tariff announcements, or do you think it's unrelated to that?
I would tend to say that is unrelated. I would say tariff announcements and stability, that's an oxymoron these days. Because it seems every week we have something new. Now, funnily enough, this week, there's actually no new tariff news this week.
Amazing.
Then at least we've been stable for a week, but that's about it. So no, I don't necessarily think that is it. Do we have uncertainty? Of course. I mean, from 1 week to the next, we can always hear at least new threats of tariffs. And we still have this one major uncertainty hanging over the market. What would the ruling be on the IEEPA tariffs? Everybody's still waiting for that.
Yes. Well, maybe the tariffs are somewhat stable right now, but let's talk about carriers and earnings reports and what's going on with the carriers right now.
Yeah, I mean, the past week saw 2 more carriers come out with numbers. So we saw really preliminary results come out from both Hyundai and Hapag-Lloyd. And the interesting element here was, prior to that, we talked about that a week ago, we had seen a result come out from Maersk and O&E. Maersk and O&E both had negative results on the EBIT level in Q4. Now, Hyundai and Hapag-Lloyd both had positive results at the EBIT level. We don't know a lot of details because both of these are preliminary. So for HMM, we simply know they came in with a positive EBIT of a bit over $200 million. For Hapag-Lloyd, also note that these are preliminary results, but that also came out positive in the sense for Hapag. What I would see is interesting here is that Hapag provided a little more detail on volumes and freight rates. So if you look at it, Hapag's volumes in Q4, measuring here year on year, was up 6.5%. And that is more than the market grew. The market grew 4.6%. So Hapag has definitely grown market share a bit during Q4. For comparison here, O&E had unchanged volumes, so they lost share. Maersk grew 8%. So Maersk actually grew their market share even more than Hapag in terms of volume in Q4. But if we then look at rate developments, now keep in mind, market rates overall are down. From a global perspective, the CTS Global Index, which is the most accurate for the entire world, showed a rate decline of 20% year on year. Hapag-Lloyd's rates were certainly also down. They were down 16%, which is still less than the entire market. So Hapag-Lloyd basically grew their market share a little bit, and they were able to stem some of the rate declines a little bit better than what we saw in the market. This was more or less on par with O&E. They also saw rate declines around the minus 16%, which is about the same as Hapag, but Maersk saw a decline of as much as 23% down. So overall, I would say, pretty strong result here from Hapag. Not much detail from HMM apart from, again, a positive EBIT, making Hyundai and Hapag so far in the club of still profitable carriers in Q4 versus O&E and Maersk that were loss-making carriers.
Do you think that cost structure is a differentiator, or do you think network mix?
That might be a third element. I don't know for HMM because we don't have the breakdown in details, but for Hapag, you can see their rates are not declining quite as fast as market. And this is a pattern we also saw emerging back, remember, in 2023 when market rates came down quickly. We also saw that pattern where Hapag, of course, at the end of the day, when the market goes down, all the carrier rates go down, but Hapag had an ability to manage their customer relations so that they could stem the flow a little longer than the other carriers, which is definitely also financially meaningful. And they seem to be able to repeat that pattern this time around.
Yeah, definitely smoothing the downturns, making it elongate. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about other news for Hapag. There was some major news that came out over the weekend.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, over the weekend, and now I was looking at the announcement that just came out here today. There's another announcement out from Hapag-Lloyd that this deal has now been signed off in Hapag and over in ZIM. Basically, Hapag is acquiring ZIM, but there are a few caveats to this. The first very important thing to note here is, as I think many are already aware, ZIM had a challenge if they wanted to sell, in that the Israeli government had what was called a golden share, because ZIM as an Israeli company is also a vital part of the Israeli government's strategic defense plans. So there was some requirements ZIM had to live up to in relation to the Israeli government. And seen from the outside, it was unlikely that any carrier would want to buy ZIM and take over that obligation. But what now appears to come out is that they've been able to find a construction where Hapag-Lloyd, together with an Israeli capital fund, basically buys ZIM but splits it in two parts. There's a small part, which will then be the Israeli capital fund, that will contain, and I believe the message that came out just now from Hapag-Lloyd said 16 vessels or something to that degree. It's basically some of the vessels owned in Israel and flagged in Israel. This will be a tiny continuing company. I don't know whether they're going to call them ZIM or New ZIM or whatever, but let's think of them like that. And that will basically be the small entity that will then also still have the Israeli government's golden share. This will be the one that links into the Israeli government strategic defense and the self-supply strategies. But the vast part of ZIM, which now has carved away the Israeli part, so to speak, that is what the Hapag-Lloyd is now acquiring. The caveat here we should mention, of course, is that it's not enough that Hapag-Lloyd and ZIM and also these people signed off of it. You need the formal approval of the Israeli government that this is a good idea. You need approval from a range of different competition authorities around the world. There's all this legalese we have to jump through. I haven't seen them put out a timeline. I would not be surprised if this deal doesn't go through in practice, where you can say now the companies are really being joined before we get to maybe beginning of 2027. We'll see how quickly that can go. But for now, it actually appears to be a done deal. What does that then mean for the market? We saw Hapag-Lloyd last year state very clearly that it was important for them strategically to continue to be a top 5 carrier. They are number 5. With this one, they're still number 5. But what changes is they move from a position where they're number 5 and number 6 and 7, which are O&E and Evergreen, were actually pretty close to Hapag-Lloyd in size. O&E and especially Evergreen's order book is massive. So if something didn't happen, Hapag-Lloyd would actually be overtaken. This acquisition, where they get most of the ZIM fleet, Hapag-Lloyd gets up to about 3 million TEU. The closest one again is O&E, which is about 2.1 million or something like that. Doesn't bring Hapag-Lloyd up to number 4, because number 4 is COSCO and they're 3.5 million TEU for now, but it definitely places them very, very firmly in the top 5 with a gap down to the ones further below. So that is good for them. There's a number of other ramifications that come out of this. Right now, ZIM has vessel sharing agreements and collaborates with MSC on, I believe, 6 Transpacific services. And obviously, when this goes through, all this volume moves to Hapag-Lloyd, which means it will go over to Gemini. So what this will do is to have a small negative competitive impact on MSC, who will either then have to find new volume to fill the vessels on these services, or might be forced to reduce their network size a little bit to right size it compared to the volumes that they have. How this will play out remains to be seen. And over on the Gemini side, again, presuming Hapag-Lloyd can hang on to the customers they get from ZIM, that's also always the challenge. But assuming Hapag-Lloyd can do that, then potentially that would mean that the Gemini network can be strengthened, especially on the Transpacific services. Whether that would result in additional service or services or result in the deployment of larger vessels also remains to be seen over there. But overall, clearly a strengthening of Hapag, but also of the Gemini network. Slight reduction in competitive ability for MSC. Another element I find interesting in this thing is, if we look at the fleet Hapag-Lloyd is now getting from ZIM, it's basically all charter vessels. And of course, charter vessels can be anything from 6 to 12 months up to what is more financing deals of 10 to 15 years. Haven't seen all the details. But this would mean that once completed, a little bit more than 50% of Hapag-Lloyd's fleet would now be on charter. And I think it's maybe important here to put things in perspective. If we go back 5-6 years before the pandemic, it was a normal rule of thumb that most carriers tended to own roughly half the vessels and charter the other half. But the developments over the last 6 years have drastically changed this. With the enormous profits the carriers have made, they have invested in a lot of ships. So right now it's actually more than norm that most of the main carriers earn about 2/3 of the vessels, have only 1/3 on charter. Hapag-Lloyd now has more than 50% on charter, which creates some flexibility because we're heading into a cyclical downturn here over 27, 28. And if you own most of your vessels, that makes you less flexible in terms of maybe reducing your fleet size for a while. Whereas if I have a lot of vessels on charter, I could potentially plan for right-sizing my fleet a little bit more nimbly over time. So again, this also places Hapag-Lloyd in a strategic advantageous position.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think your point about the chartered vessels is particularly interesting because we've talked about how the order book is very large for this upcoming year. There's a lot of capacity that's going to be injected into the market. So it definitely does seem like a really smart move strategically from Hapag's side to invest or acquire ZIM. Do you think it has any negative impact for the shippers that value ZIM's flexibility and those fast services that ZIM has currently?
I think that depends very much on what shipper you're looking at. Every time we see one carrier acquiring another, the carrier being acquired, you would always have that concern. Will the customers actually stay, or are they suddenly going to be scattered all over? And over the last 20 years, it's clear that there's a big difference from carrier to carrier. What has their ability been to retain the customers that they acquired? Hapag-Lloyd has been really good, as far as I can see, in retaining a substantial amount of the clients they have acquired in the many different acquisitions that they have done over the years. How it will fare this time, of course, remains to be seen, and I would be absolutely sure that 2 weeks from now, when everybody in this industry goes to the usual cargo festival over at the TPM in Long Beach, where basically everyone who knows anyone in the industry shows up, all the other carriers, they will bring their A game in terms of trying to approach SIM-securing customers and say, are you sure you don't want to jump ship? Of course, that's part of the whole competitive game.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens at TPM this year. I know we'll be there, and Lars, you generally do your closing speech there, so that'll be
Oh, yes.
Great, very insightful. All right, well, let's keep moving. So there was a new maritime action plan that was proposed in the US. Could you talk a little bit about what it is, what it means?
Yeah, we have to first think back to, again, I think it was late spring, early summer last year, an executive order came out in terms of maritime security in the US. One of the action points there was to create a maritime action plan to strengthen the maritime domain in the US. This is a very, very broad scope. So it includes not just container shipping, but also tankers, bulkers, military vessels, icebreakers, contains shipyards. There are provisions in there for training seafarers. It's a very, very broad scope. But if I narrow it down also in this context to what are some of the relevant parts about the container shipping, there are a few elements that are worth noting. First, everybody should please keep in mind, this is just a political proposal document for now. This is not a law. It's not even suggested as a law. It's a political document to say this is what we would like to go down the path. So all stakeholders in the US have ample time to have a look at this and find out, is this great? Then go out and support it. Is this horrible? Then go out and lobby against it. I mean, that's part of how the political process works. So that aside, when I look at it, there are two things I especially want to pick up on here. One is a suggestion to have fee on cargo being imported on non-US vessels. There's not a proposal per se as to what should the number be, but there are two specific examples mentioned. The examples are mentioned of either 1 cent per kilogram of cargo or 25 cents per kilogram of cargo. And if I try to do a little bit of quick math on that one, this translates into somewhere between $150 per 40 foot to $3,750 per 40 foot. I would leave it for the shippers to do the math in terms of whether they like or dislike fees to that degree. Everybody has opinions in terms of whether this is good and bad. Again, I would remind, this is a political document. It's a valid political stance from a government to say we want to strengthen the maritime domain. Perfectly fine. one of the elements here is to entice companies to build more ships in the US. And in principle, if you make it more expensive to use foreign ships, you make it more attractive to build local ships. So I tried to do a little bit of back of the envelope math and say, does this then add up? If you go to the really high end and say, fine, we're going to push the 25 cents per kilo. That's going to cost the container shipping industry around $50 billion per year. Wow. Would that be sufficient so it suddenly becomes interesting to build US ships? Because then the political aim has been achieved. So I tried to back it down and say, we already know Matson is building 3,600 TEU ships on US shipyards. These ships come at a cost of $330 million each. Right now, I can build a similar ship in China at $50 million. So that's a $280 million premium. But if I can then save almost $4,000 per 40 foot because of the fees, maybe it's worthwhile. What's the payback time? But the problem is the payback time here would still be more than 5.5 years, even with those massive fees. From the time where I start to work on maybe ordering US vessels until I get them, again, learning from the Matson process, we're talking 3 to 4 years. So all in all, at least for back of the envelope, even at the high end of these fees, for a shipping line to then actively go and buy US vessels, because this would be financially attractive, that would require confidence that these rules, once implemented, are absolutely not changed for at least the next 8 to 10 years. So it requires that level of certainty. Different shipping lines might have different risk profiles, but I think it will be hard to find a shipping line right now that would have any confidence that the US regulations on this topic would absolutely not change over the next decade with changing administrations. So all of this boiling down to, this is a political document, which is fine, but if you run the math in that document, it is hard to see how even in the more extreme case that this would be sufficient to achieve the political ambitions laid out. That's on the financial side. Another element that is proposed in there, and we have seen that come up in proposals also in the whole USTR affair last year, is the proposal that there should be a certain percentage of imported cargo that must be imported on US vessels. Again, no numbers are suggested at all here, but the concept, we've seen that before, it is now proposed again. So I would urge especially any stakeholders that has anything to do with commercial maritime operations to go read the document and find out whether this is something that is fine or whether it's not fine, and then use whatever approach you have on talking to the local legislators on either telling them this is fantastic, full speed ahead, or this is absolutely devastating, please change it. That's how the process works.
Yeah.
And as a final comment, because it's also listed specifically in the document, remember the $1 million fees on Chinese ships last year, the USTR fees. Mm-hmm. They are still here. I mean, they never went away. They were only postponed for a year, and that is also mentioned explicitly in this document. The $1 million fees on Chinese ships, as it is right now, stands to come back into force in November 26. And if we look at the play out last year, that would very likely also mean that the Chinese retaliation is similarly on the table. Do I believe we get $1 million fees when we come to November? I would actually not think so. My expectation would be that there would be negotiations between the US and China to try to get this resolved before we get to November.
Yeah, that would be a very drastic change if that's implemented.
Yes.
With a lot of repercussions. I think your point about if this legislation passes, how likely are companies going to be to invest in buying US built ships when it takes, 5-7 years for these ships to be built? And then what happens if the legislation is negated?
Yeah, exactly. And you can say there's always the argument, if you make a protected market where there is barriers to entry from somebody outside, yeah, you can have higher prices and you can support higher costs as long as those barriers are there. But in an industry where your investments then range a very long time into the future, you need a high degree of certainty. That to some degree it does exist in the US. There's the Jones Act. The Jones Act has now been there for a century, and I don't think anybody believes that's going to change anytime soon, which is of course also why a carrier like Matson does go ahead and buys extremely expensive US built container ships, because they have confidence that this protection, in this case the Jones Act, will remain for a long, long time to come, and therefore it is worthwhile. But raising a new protectionist barrier is going to take a long time to create the level of confidence that this is actually going to stick around, not just for a few years, but for decades.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you on your point to give the document a read, and if you have opinions on it, good or bad, definitely share them with the legislators that are responsible for passing the bill or voting against it. Make sure your opinion is heard. But super interesting stuff. We'll definitely report on updates there. We got a few more topics today. Big juicy episode that we've got.
It's a packed week.
It really is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Day 10 product from the Ocean Alliance.
Yeah, the reason I wanted to pick up on that is there's an interesting quirk showing up, not so much with the Day 10 product. Mind you, for those that don't know, Ocean Alliance have now been around for 10 years. And when they first launched, they called their network Day 1. And when they revamped it a year later, they called it Day 2. And here we are, now they call it Day 10. Yeah, exactly. That's great for consistency. There was a report coming out yesterday from Sea Intelligence, and one of the small tidbits I picked up on there was the new Ocean Alliance network actually scales back quite a bit on some of the direct connections, specifically from the port of Busan to a range of ports in North Europe. In itself, that would not necessarily make that much of an interesting tidbit, but I see it also in connection with the way the Gemini network changed when that got into place last year. Because Gemini, which relies on very few large hubs, eliminated all direct calls from Busan to Europe. Busan right now is serviced in the Gemini network by then using a shuttle that goes directly down to Tanjung Pilar Pass. And this is then where it goes to Europe. And to me, this begins to look a little bit like a pattern. Keep in mind, Busan is right now the world's 7th largest container port. It's a massive transshipment hub. And no change in terms of servicing Asia to US. Busan is extremely well positioned there. But when it comes to then going from Asia back to Europe, it seems that Busan is losing a little bit of terrain here. First, they lose some of their connectivity from Gemini. Now they're also losing a little bit of their connectivity from Ocean Alliance. I think this is a strategic challenge for Busan in terms of how do they keep their position as one of the world's absolutely leading hubs if they're beginning to lose connectivity to one of the largest markets.
Yeah, it's a really interesting position to be in. Does it have an impact if you're a shipper that uses these routings, or should you be concerned about it?
Because you can't make a sweepingly simple conclusion for shippers. Let's take a very practical example. You might sit there, now you heard me say that, well, I actually said it last year as well, that's okay, Gemini does not connect Busan directly to Europe. If you look at some of the networks, just to throw out an example, MSC does go direct from Busan to North Europe. But you can also find examples where even though MSC goes direct, some of the Gemini services are faster, despite using transshipment, because some of these MSC services then call a large number of ports along the way. So there is not one conclusion for shippers. It depends on what is the precise port pairs, what are the precise services they're using. Of course, making life a little bit more complex to deal with.
Yeah, that's such a good point, though, because I think there's a tendency for shippers to want to choose the direct routing, but you really do need to look into the details of how long does it take, how many origins is it stopping at. You might end up having more delays because of multiple stops with the direct service. Very, very good point there. All right. Well, our last topic today is to talk about Red Sea return and what's going on there. So could you give us an update?
Yeah, there was one slight thing that I think was interesting to see here in the week. If we think back to mid-January, when Maersk announced they were now going to permanently shift their Mekelle service back to a Suez routing. The Mekelle service is the one that connects the US East Coast to the Middle East. And a substantial amount of the vessels deployed on this service are actually US flagged vessels. Of course, not the entire vessel, but there are solid volumes of cargo on these ones that are, for example, moving from the US to the US military across the Middle East. It's one of, let's call them the resupply boats there. So Maersk made a very nice announcement, and they even listed the specific vessels that were then going to shift and go through. And if you look at the first 3 vessels that go from the Middle East back to US East Coast, they have all gone through the Suez route as clockwork. Perfectly fine. If we now look at the eastbound ones, the ones that go from US back to the Middle East, the first one was listed as Maersk Detroit. And when Maersk Detroit then got to the Strait of Gibraltar, it turned south. And I just checked right before the podcast here, it's right now located off the coast of Guinea, off West Africa. So instead of going through the Suez, as was stated by Maersk, it's actually now taking the round Africa route. The next one in that direction is the Maersk Sebarok. We don't know yet what that's going to do. It's actually right outside the Strait of Gibraltar, about to call the port of Tangiers. So we'll probably only know tomorrow which direction that one is going to take. But I find that a little bit surprising. Maersk apparently changed their mind, at least on that first Maersk Detroit that went eastbound. I don't know what their assessment could be. I can venture the guess that the vessels that go from the Middle East to US East Coast, they start in Salalah, which means the moment I say, okay, fine, I'm going to send it through the Red Sea, well, that's what you do right there. So you can look at the situation, does it feel safe, and then you send it through. But in the opposite direction, once I'm committed, then I go all the way in through the Mediterranean. If I then get to the bottom of the Mediterranean, and now it becomes dangerous, then my vessel needs to do a U-turn and back all the way out of the Mediterranean again. So the risk profile is actually different depending on whether you go eastbound or westbound. And for some reason, at least, Maersk have decided that the first vessel going from US East Coast down to the Middle East, that went around Africa.
Yeah, it's a good call out on the risk profile differences going eastbound. I'm sure if you're a shipper using that service, you'd be kind of annoyed if it gets all the way down there. The ship has to turn around. Now you're adding, a week plus to your transit time.
Yeah. Which is actually what happened to some shippers in the late part of 2023, in the early part of the Red Sea crisis.
Yeah.
Because at that point in time, first everybody went around Africa, then Maersk was quick to jump back to go to a Suez routing, and then they have to turn back again. So they actually did have some of these that went to the bottom of the Mediterranean, then had to do a U-turn and back out again.
Yeah, so a bit of a learning experience that they're kind of implementing the lessons maybe now. All right. Well, anything else to add to today's episode?
I think we have already pushed plenty on here. Those of our listeners that listen to this in the car, I hope we filled up your entire ride this time around.
Yes. Well, thank you for everyone who's still listening. We appreciate you. If you haven't subscribed already, we're on Apple Music, Spotify, we're also on YouTube. And until next week, we'll be back then. But I hope you all have an awesome week. We'll have a guest next week as well. So you'll have another interesting voice to listen to. But until then, have a great one.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NVOCCs. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.